Darkness. It was suffocating, endless, and absolute, a crushing weight pressed against her chest, making each breath a struggle. The air was stale, thick with an eerie dampness that carried the faint scent of decay. Panic clawed at her mind as her hands trembled, fingers brushing against smooth, wooden walls that encased her. Her heart pounded violently against her ribs. She tried to move, but there was barely any space. Her fingers fumbled, pressing against the ceiling above her. Wood. Solid, unyielding wood. The realization struck her like a bolt of lightning. She was trapped. She was confined inside something small, something rectangular. A coffin. A muffled scream tore from her throat, but the space swallowed the sound, reducing it to a pathetic whimper. Desperation surged through her veins as she banged her fist against the wood, ignoring the sharp sting of splinters digging into her skin. "Help!" she cried, her voice hoarse and broken. "Somebody, please!" No response. Tears welled in her eyes. The overwhelming silence wrapped around her like a death shroud, suffocating and merciless. Her breathing became erratic, each inhale consuming what little oxygen remained. She forced herself to calm down. Panicking would only make things worse. Who am I? How did I get here? Her mind scrambled for answers, but her memory was a gaping void. She couldn't remember her name, her face, or how she ended up inside this living nightmare. All she knew was that she shouldn't be here. She was alive. The thought sent another wave of horror crashing over her. If she was alive, then why had she been buried? Suddenly, something shifted above her. A faint scratching sound, like fingernails skimming against the wood. Her body stiffened. Was someone there? A rescuer? A grave digger? She held her breath, heart hammering as she strained to listen. The scratching grew louder, more deliberate, like something or someone was trying to get in. Then a whisper, so faint it was almost imperceptible. "You shouldn't be awake." A chill snaked down her spine. The voice was eerily soft, almost inhuman. She pressed her palm against the wood, unsure if she should respond. "Who's there?" she rasped. Silence. Then a violent thud shook the coffin. The impact was so strong it forced a gasp from her lips. The whisper returned, now right above her. "Go back to sleep?" The lid of the coffin shifted slightly. Just a fraction. Enough for a thin sliver of light to creep in. And then she saw it. A single, bloodshot, eyes staring down at her through the gap. A guttural scream tore from her throat. But before she could react, the lid was forced shut again. The world was plunged back into darkness. Her breathing came in ragged gasps. What was that? Who or what was outside? Suddenly, a different sound filled the air. It wasn't scratching. It wasn't whispering. It was the unmistakable sound of dirt being shoveled. They were burying her. Again, she screamed, pounded against the wood, kicked as hard as she could, but it was no use. The sound of dirt cascading onto the coffin grew louder, drowning out her cries. She was sinking, disappearing into the earth's cold embrace. "No, please, I'm alive. I'm alive." She gasped for air, her lungs burning. The oxygen was thinning. Her vision blurred. Just when she thought she would pass out, a sharp noise cut through the suffocating panic. A metallic clang. Something above her snapped open with a loud creak. Light poured in, blinding her. Then, rough hands grabbed her and pulled her upward. She emerged, coughing, gasping for air, her body trembling as she collapsed onto the ground. Fresh air filled her lungs, but she barely had a moment to breathe before she heard it. The whisper. This time, it wasn't above her. It was all around her. "You shouldn't be awake." Her blood ran cold. She turned her head, her vision adjusting to the dim glow of lanterns flickering around the cemetery. And then she saw them. Figures. Dozens of them. Standing between the tombstones, their faces shrouded in shadow. Watching her. And they weren't breathing. Her chest tightened. These weren't normal people. Something was wrong. One of the figures stepped forward. The same one who had pulled her out. A man in a tattered suit, his skin pale, almost translucent. His eyes sunken and hollow. "You don't belong here," he murmured. His voice was empty, devoid of warmth. She tried to speak, but her throat felt raw, her body weak. The man crouched beside her, his fingers brushing against the cold dirt. He tilted his head, observing her with eerie curiosity. "They buried you too soon," he finally said. "But you were never meant to leave." A sharp gust of wind howled through the cemetery, sending a shiver down her spine. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to sit up. Who are you?" she whispered. The man's lips curled into a grim smile. More importantly, he said, "Who are you?" Her mind reeled. Who was she? She tried to remember, but something blocked her thoughts. A heavy fog clouded her mind, making it impossible to grasp onto any solid memory. She stared at the man, her pulse quickening. I don't know." The wind carried a faint, ghostly laugh through the air. The other figures remained motionless, their gazes fixed on her. The man's expression darkened. "Then you truly are lost." A sharp pain suddenly erupted in her chest. She clutched at her shirt, gasping. It felt like something inside her was being ripped away. The man stood, taking a step back. "It's starting," he murmured. "What's starting?" she choked out. The figures moved closer, their forms shifting unnaturally, as if reality itself bent around them. The whispering grew louder, swirling the air like a sinister chant. She tried to stand, but her body refused to obey. The pain in her chest deepened, spreading like icy tendrils. Then, one of the figures stepped into the lantern's light, and she saw its face. Her own. Her breath hitched. No, that wasn't possible. The figure, her reflection, stared at her with empty eyes, lips curling into a wicked smile. "You shouldn't be awake," it whispered. And then, the ground beneath her collapsed. She plummeted into the darkness, the voices echoing around her as she was swallowed whole. She was falling. The world around her dissolved into a swirling abyss of shadows and whispers, an endless descent into the unknown. Wind howled past her ears, though she couldn't feel it against her skin. The pain in her chest was unbearable, like invisible hands were clawing at something deep inside her, something that didn't belong. Then, abruptly, silence. Her body slammed into something solid. She gasped, the impact knocking the breath from her lungs. But there was no floor beneath her, no ground, just nothing. She floated in the darkness, weightless, suspended in an eerie limbo. For a moment, she thought she was alone. Then she heard it, a slow, rhythmic thumping, like a heartbeat, steady and relentless. But it wasn't coming from her chest. It was coming from below. She tried to move, but her limbs felt sluggish, as though she was submerged in thick, invisible tar. Panic surged through her veins. "Hello?" Her voice was barely a whisper, swallowed instantly by the void. A pause. Then, something shifted. A flicker of movement beneath her. She strained her eyes, trying to see through the suffocating blackness. Shapes began to emerge, twisting, writhing figures just beyond her reach. They were whispering, their voices layered over one another, speaking in an unintelligible, guttural murmur. Then, one voice broke through the noise, clear and unmistakable. "You shouldn't be awake." The same phrase, the same chilling warning. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned her head sharply, expecting to see the bloodshot eye from before. Instead, she saw something far worse. A face, or at least something trying to be a face. It hovered just inches from hers, an amalgamation of shifting, melting flesh. No eyes, just hollow sockets filled with writhing shadows. Its mouth hung open unnaturally wide, lips curling back to reveal jagged, uneven teeth. It was grinning, her body locked in terror. She wanted to scream, to thrash, but her muscles refused to obey. The creature tilted its head, the skin on its face rippling like liquid. Then it spoke. "You don't belong here." A skeletal hand shot out from the darkness, wrapping around her wrist. The sensation was ice cold, burning against her skin. It pulled. She fought against it, her body jerking violently. But it was relentless, dragging her deeper into the abyss. "No! Stop!" she gasped, struggling with everything she had. But the more she fought, the weaker she became. The whispers crescendoed, a deafening chorus of voices hissing her name, except she didn't know her name. Then, just as she was about to be swallowed whole, a burst of light, blinding, searing light. The shadows recoiled, the monstrous hand releasing its grip. A piercing shriek echoed to the void, and then she wasn't falling anymore. She was standing, her eyes adjusted to the sudden brightness, revealing an entirely different place. No longer trapped in an abyss, she now stood in the middle of an old, decrepit room. The walls were made of rotting wood, peeling wallpaper barely clinging to the surface. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something more metallic, blood. She turned in slow horror. A coffin lay open in the center of the room. Her coffin. Her heart pounded violently. Then movement. A shadow flickered in the corner. She spun around, pressing herself against the wall. A figure stood just beyond the reach of the dim, flickering light. It was watching her. Then it stepped forward. It was the same man from before, the one who had pulled her from the grave. His hollow eyes locked onto hers. "You weren't supposed to wake up," he said, voice like rust scraping against metal. Her throat was dry. Who are you?" The man ignored her question. His gaze drifted toward the coffin, then back to her. "Do you know why you're here?" "I don't even know who I am," she snapped, frustration breaking through her fear. The man exhaled slowly. "That's because you weren't meant to remember." A sharp pain stabbed through her skull. She stumbled, gripping her temples as fragmented images flashed behind her eyes. A hospital room, beeping monitors, someone crying, a doctor's grim face. The feeling of something leaving her. She gasped. The memories slipped through her fingers like water, disappearing before she could hold on to them. The man watched her carefully. "It's returning, isn't it?" "What's returning?" she demanded. Before he could answer, the room lurched violently. The walls groaned as if something massive was shifting behind them. A deep, guttural noise echoed through the air. The man's expression darkened. "They know you're here." The whispers returned, louder, more insistent. The air grew thick, pressing down on her like an invisible weight. Who are they?" she choked out. The man grabbed her wrist, his grip unnervingly cold. "We need to leave. Now." But it was too late. The walls split open, revealing an abyss of writhing shadows. Hands, hundreds of them, crawled out from the darkness, fingers stretching toward her. She tried to run, but her feet sank into floor as if the house itself was consuming her. The voices screamed, louder than ever. "You shouldn't be awake." A hand latched onto her ankle, yanking her downward. The last thing she saw before she was dragged back into the dark was her own face staring back at her, grinning. She was drowning. The darkness swallowed her whole, thick and suffocating, as though she had been plunged into a bottomless ocean. The whispers wrapped around her, pressing against her skull, each syllable drilling into her mind like knives. "You shouldn't be awake." Her limbs flailed, but there was nothing to grab onto, just an endless void pulling her deeper. The voices grew louder, overlapping until they became an unbearable screech. Her lungs burned. Then, silence. She gasped as her body suddenly hit something solid. The impact rattled her bones, but the sensation was fleeting. A thick fog curled around her, cold and damp, clinging to her skin like living tendrils. She sat up slowly, her breath coming in uneven gasps. The whispers were gone, but the oppressive weight of the air remained. She wasn't in the coffin anymore. She wasn't even in the house. The world around her was wrong. The ground beneath her wasn't solid. It moved, shifting like a mass of writhing bodies trapped just beneath the surface. The air smelled of damp earth and something metallic, blood. A dim, eerie glow illuminated the landscape, revealing an endless field of open graves. Shadows moved between the tombstones, not walking, crawling. Their twisted forms slithered along the ground, whispering in tongues she couldn't understand. Panic clawed at her throat. She scrambled backward, only to collide with something behind her. The man. He stood over her, eyes dark and hollow. His face remained expressionless, but there was something wrong about the way he looked at her, like he was seeing something beneath her skin. "You're remembering, aren't you?" he said. She shook her head, her pulse hammering in her ears. I don't understand any of this. Why am I here? What is this place? The man knelt in front of her, his gaze never wavering. This is where they send the ones who wake up. She swallowed hard. Who? The ones who control what happens after death. She shivered. The coldness in his voice made her stomach twist. This isn't real, she whispered, trying to convince herself. The man's expression darkened. It's more real than you think. Before she could respond, the ground beneath them shifted violently. The crawling figures had stopped moving. They were staring, their empty sockets locked onto her, their mouths stretching open in silent screams. Then, in unison, they surged forward. She barely had time to react before the man grabbed her arm, yanking her to her feet. Run. She didn't hesitate. Her feet pounded against the unstable ground as a horde of twisted figures closed in behind her. Their hands clawed at the air, their whispers rising into an ear-splitting shriek. She didn't dare look back. Ahead, a single gravestone stood apart from the rest, illuminated by an unnatural glow. The name etched into it made her blood turn to ice. It was her own. She skidded to a stop, her chest rising and falling in rapid, panicked breaths. Her name, her death date. Her hands trembled as she reached out, tracing the letters. The second she touched the stone, memories flooded her mind. A hospital room, the scent of antiseptic, the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor, a doctor's grim expression, a voice, soft, sorrowful, whispering, "She's gone." Then darkness. She gasped, stumbling backward. The world spun. The crawling figures had stopped again, standing eerily still. You remember now, don't you? She turned slowly. The man stood a few feet away, his eyes locked onto hers. She knew why she had woken up in the coffin. She had died. She had already died. Her hands shook as she looked at the man, horror dawning in her eyes. Why am I awake? He exhaled slowly. Because you weren't supposed to go. Her pulse pounded in her ears. What do you mean? Before he could answer, the ground trembled violently. The grave split open in hands. Hundreds of them erupted from the soil. The figures let out an inhuman wail as they lunged forward, their faces contorting with rage. The man's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist. We have to go. Now. She barely had time to react before the ground beneath her collapsed, and she was falling. She was falling again. The world spun around her in a dizzying blur of darkness and crimson light. The wind screamed past her ears, but she felt weightless, as though she wasn't falling through air but something much thicker, something alive. Then impact. Her body hit solid ground, but there was no pain. She gasped, sucking in air like she'd been drowning, and rolled onto her hands and knees. The floor beneath her was warm, pulsing faintly like a beating heart. She pushed herself up, her pulse hammering in her ears. The man was beside her, standing calmly as though the violent drop had meant nothing to him. Her breath came in sharp, uneven bursts. Where were we now? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned his gaze to their surroundings. It was a room, but not like any room she had ever seen before. The walls were lined with coffins, stacked haphazardly, some open, some nailed shut. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and something deeper, older, like burning metal and earth after storm. At the far end of the room stood a door. It was massive, stretching high into the shadows above them. It wasn't made of wood or metal, but something else entirely. Something shifting. It pulsed, dark veins of light threading through its surface. The man's voice was quiet but firm. This is the threshold. She swallowed, her throat dry. Threshold to what? His gaze flicked to her, unreadable. The place beyond death. She took a shaky step back. No, I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't have woken up. Exactly, he interrupted. His voice edged with something she couldn't decipher. You weren't meant to wake up, but you did, and now they want you back. The whispers started again. She whipped her head around. The coffins moved, the lids rattling violently as something inside them struggled to get out. The walls trembled. A deep, guttural groan vibrating through the floor. Then, a hand burst through one of the coffin lids. She let out a sharp gasp, stumbling backward. The hand was wrong, skeletal but wrapped in strips of decayed, pulsating flesh. More hands erupted from the other coffins, clawing at the air. The whispers turned into screams. The man grabbed her wrist. "We don't have much time." She yanked her arm back, panic flashing her eyes. "Who are you?" His expression remained unreadable. "The only one trying to keep you out of their hands." The first coffin lid crashed open completely, and then they emerged. Figures, twisted, rotting versions of her. Their hollow, sunken faces bore grotesque imitations of her features, but their eyes were nothing but black voids, seeping darkness like ink. Their mouths stretched too wide, revealing jagged, uneven teeth. She took another step back. Her heart beat a violent thunder in her chest. What are they?" "They're what's left of you," the man said grimly. "Pieces of yourself, trapped between worlds. You were never supposed to wake up, but now that you have, they're here to take you back." The first creature lurched forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. The others followed, crawling toward her, fingers dragging against the ground with sickening cracks. She felt a scream claw its way up her throat, but no sound came out. The man pulled her toward the door. "The only way out is through here, but you have to decide. Do you want to stay in the world of the living, or do you want to go back?" The creatures howled, surging forward. She spun to face the door. The pulsing light beneath its surface called to her, deep and aching, like something buried within her soul was trying to break free. The ground trembled as the creatures lunged. The man's voice was urgent. "Decide. Now!" Her breath hitched, her body tensed. And then, she reached for the door. The second her fingers touched its surface, a blinding light erupted from within. The creature screamed, a shriek of agony so unbearable it sent her reeling. The entire room shook, cracks spiderwebbing across the floor. The light expanded, devouring everything in its path. The whispers faded. The howls ceased. And then, silence. She opened her eyes. The door was gone. The coffins were gone. The man was gone. She stood in a vast, endless white void. She was alone. Her heartbeat slowed. Her breathing steadied. Then, a voice, soft, familiar, calling her name, her real name. And suddenly, she remembered everything. She wasn't dead, but she wasn't alive either. She stood in an endless white void, her body weightless, her mind caught in a strange haze of memory and reality. The voice calling her name was distant, yet painfully familiar. It tugged at something deep inside her, something she had forgotten. Then the void shifted. The whiteness bled away, replaced by images, fragments of a life she had lost. A hospital room. She lay in a bed, tubes running from her arms, her skin pale and cold. Machines beeped softly, their rhythmic pulses filling the sterile air. A doctor stood at her bedside, speaking in hushed tones to someone sitting beside her, her mother. Tears streamed down the woman's face as she clutched her daughter's limp hand. "She's gone," the doctor said, his voice heavy with finality. The heart monitor let out a long, flat beep. A sharp, icy shock ran through her as she watched the scene unfold. No, that wasn't right. She was here. She was awake. But she had died. Hadn't she? The world around her shifted again, and suddenly, she wasn't the void anymore. She stood at the edge of her hospital bed, staring at her own lifeless body. The machines were still humming, the steady beeping of the monitor echoing through the room. She turned, heart pounding. Someone was standing in the doorway. The man. His face was calm, unreadable, but there was something in his gaze, something knowing. "This is it," he said quietly. She swallowed hard. "This is real." He nodded. "Your body is still here, but your soul is caught between worlds. That's why you woke up in the coffin." She felt dizzy, her mind struggling to process what he was saying. "Why did this happen to me?" His expression darkened slightly. "Because you weren't supposed to die." The words hit her like a cold wave. "What?" "You were never meant to cross over, But something pulled you too soon, and now you have a choice. She turned back to the hospital bed, her stomach twisting. Her mother still sat beside her, gripping her lifeless hand, whispering words she couldn't hear. "I can go back?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "Yes," the man said, "but only if you want to." She tore her gaze away from the bed and looked at him. "And if I don't?" The air around them grew heavy, as though something unseen was pressing down on her. The walls of the hospital room darkened, shifting, the edges of reality fraying at the seams. "If you don't," the man said, his voice low, "then you go back to the coffin." The memory of the suffocating darkness, the pounding against the wood, the whispers that clawed at her mind, it all came flooding back in a wave of terror. "No," she whispered. The man took a slow step forward. "Then choose." Her breath came in short, sharp gasps. She turned back to the hospital bed. Her mother's shoulders shook with silent sobs. A lump rose in her throat. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and touched her own hand. The second her skin met her own, a blinding light erupted around her. The hospital room vanished. The white void returned, but this time it wasn't empty. She was falling again, but this time she wasn't afraid. She heard the heartbeat first. A slow, rhythmic thump-thump, thump-thump. Then air. Her lungs burned as she gasped, her chest rising violently. Every nerve in her body screamed as sensation returned. A sharp, piercing cry filled the air, her mother's sobs. She opened her eyes. She was back. The ceiling of the hospital room swam into focus, blurry at first, but growing clearer by the second. The dull beep of the monitor wasn't flat anymore. It was steady, alive. Tears streamed down her mother's face as she clutched her hand. "Oh my God! Oh my God, you're awake?" She swallowed, her throat raw, her body weak. But she was here. She was alive. And as she lay there, feeling the warmth of her mother's hand around hers, she remembered something the man had said. You weren't supposed to die. But she had. She had died, woken up in a coffin, and clawed her way back. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the grave, something had let her go. Or maybe, just maybe, it was still waiting.